I'm glad that you're in a good mood. All right. So today we're going to talk about Nicomachean Ethics Book 3, chapters 1 through 5. I didn't make you read the whole book because chapters 1 through 5 are really hard. And then we will pick up some more reading as we get into the virtues. But we are going to discuss whatever you guys have questions about. Also, I neglected to tell you this, and I should have. I already have a lecture recorded for chapter 1, which I think is the hardest one. So I'm happy to share that with you guys if it would possibly make it clearer for you. Okay, awesome. Okay. All right, so I am going to try to put my computer down somewhere that makes it a little more comfortable. Awesome. So this is the book where Aristotle introduces his notion of the voluntary. And it's one of the arguments that is both most philosophically rich and difficult at first to understand. In fact, people are still fighting over it. I have my own interpretation, but you don't have to agree with me. What we do all understand to one degree or another is the following, that in order to be deserving of praise and blame, whatever you do must be voluntary. It's my opinion that Aristotle meant what he said at the beginning of book 1, chapter 1, and I'll read that line to you. He says, since virtue is concerned with passions and actions, and on voluntary passions and actions, praise and blame are bestowed, and on those involuntary, blah, 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 blah. What I take him to be very sincere about is that passions can be voluntary. So you notice he says voluntary. Oh yeah, Grace, go ahead.
Just to clarify, what were we supposed to read for today?
I thought it was book 3, chapters 1 through 5. Am I wrong?
It was, yeah. I was just making sure because you said book 1, so I was like, oops.
Oh, I meant chapter 1. No. We did book 1 a long time ago. That would be a throwback. Okay, so yeah, chapter 1 of book 3. My bad. So a lot of people think that emotions or passions can only be blameworthy vicariously through coming from a character. I actually think Aristotle was very sincere and didn't mess up here. I think he means it can be blameworthy for feelings. I do think that. Of course, it's very, it has to be qualified under certain circumstances. But it's important that we blame and praise people at least for actions, possibly for passions, and that when we praise or blame people, that we do it because it was voluntary. Can anybody guess why that might matter?
About the voluntary thing?
Yeah, well, like, why does it matter so much in that we only praise and blame things that are voluntary?
Because if you do something that's involuntary, that action didn't come from you.
That's right. The action didn't come from you. And also, we're worried about making people better. Aristotle is very clear about this in book 1 when he says that we aren't just trying to learn what ethics are because we're curious. We want to learn what ethics are to be better people. And when you praise and blame people for the wrong things, you might actually make them worse. If you blame somebody for something that wasn't their fault, that will confuse them. And it also won't help them in the future, because if it wasn't their fault in the first time, how could they possibly avoid doing it again in the second place when they didn't even do it the first time? Similarly, if we praise people for things that are not up to them, that did not come from them, then you start to give people the wrong idea that they deserve praise for things that aren't really their doing. So praise and blame are essential to raising children well. They're essential to communicating to children and each other, whether we have crossed the line or whether we have exceeded expectations in the case of praise. So it's really important, Aristotle, that we only do this right, that you don't just praise and blame willy-nilly. It's got to be right. And he also thinks that there are some times when we want to make excuses for people, and while our hearts are in the right place, we're actually doing a disservice. So that's why we get this idea of the so-called mixed actions. Basically, the idea here is that just because you are in a bad situation where your choices are terrible, it does not mean that whatever you choose is not yours. It's still voluntary. It just might be a voluntary choice among crappy options. So that's basically what's going on in chapter 1. We get what I call the 2 conditions for voluntary in this part of Aristotle's writing. You have to be the source of the act or passion. So it has to literally come from you, and you are your soul. And while he doesn't say it here, we have good reason to believe he just means the parts of your soul that are human, that are primarily and predominantly human. So remember, your soul has reason, appetite, and nutrition. All living things have nutritive soul. Animals have appetite too, but our appetite is a little special because it can listen to reason. Of course, animals' appetite can't listen to reason because animals don't have reason. So our appetite is human in that way, that it can actually kind of transcend itself and piggyback on reason. And then, of course, reason is our distinguishing mark. So the things that are voluntary for us are going to be things that are involving our appetite and our reason, the parts of us that are most us, most who we are. And so we have to be the source. And turns out if we are involved in it in any way, Aristotle's going to call it voluntary to some degree or another. And we also have to know the particulars. It's really important that we know the particulars. And by particulars, we really just mean the facts of the situation and the relevant facts. You don't have to know, like if I'm acting in my office, I don't need to know, the weight of the bookshelf if I'm not acting on the bookshelf, right? I probably don't even need to know the weight of the bookshelf even if I am. But there are certain facts that one needs to know to make a choice that is an expression of who they are. So if I think the bookshelf is really light and it's not, and I go ask somebody to go pick it up and they hurt themselves, I was not aware of what I was asking them to do. So that actually makes it less my action. So you got these two things. It's got to be the source. It's got to come from you, and you have to know whatever the particulars are in the situation where your ignorance does not cause your action. Aristotle goes into some really interesting stuff that I get very excited about different types of ignorance. Ignorance of particulars is like the kind of ignorance that makes mistakes, and then ignorance of universals, which is actually mysterious, is what it is to be vicious. The vicious person is ignorant in that sense. And then from chapter 2, we go on to wish, and we go on to choice rather. And in choice, we get a little bit about what wish and opinion are. And then let me see, in chapter 3, just kind of letting you guys know. So chapter 2 is what is decision. Chapter 3 is what sorts of things do we deliberate about? So what does it mean for something to be possible? And chapter 4, we have the idea of what role do wishes, ends, and the good have in actions, because sometimes you can wish for something and choose that the means that you think will get there, but it's not going to actually get you there. That's when we have failed attempts. And then finally, last but certainly not least, for today, I wanted to discuss why Aristotle thinks that the vicious person is responsible for their character. In book 3, chapter 5, he more or less states that the vicious person is, but there are some controversial claims there that a lot of people, since he wrote this, and quite literally like for the last 2,300 something years, have been arguing with him about. They think he's being unfair. So we can talk about that. All right. So now that I've warmed you all up, I want to see where you guys want to start talking about the reading. Do you have questions about the reading? Let's start with that. Are there questions? Was there something that you didn't get? Grace, I saw you first. And you can just unmute yourselves unless there's like a conflict.
Can you go over the wish part? I didn't get that.
Okay, wish. All right, let me find the exact Stephanus numbers here. Hold on. So wish is the desire for the end. And we wish for ends like happiness or health. But the good is not what is always, in fact, wished for by individual men. So, for example, I can wish to be healthy, and I can falsely believe that a diet of exclusively chocolate cake will make me healthy. And so while I wish for health, in a sense, I'm choosing the opposite of what my goal is. I just don't know it. It's unbeknownst to me. So wish tends to be for things that are a little less defined, and they're the kinds of things that, in a way, everybody wants. So everybody wishes to be happy, Just some of us are going about it really the wrong way. So we think we want other things because we think they're contributing to our wishes, and it's because of our misunderstanding that we in fact do something bad. No one ever does something bad on purpose, according to Aristotle. He agrees with Socrates in that sense. That if you do something bad, there is a sense in which you thought it was good. Now, you might be one of those people who, is like, F the world, and I don't care that everybody else thinks that stealing is wrong and they're just suckers. But that means that you sincerely think they're wrong. It doesn't mean that you're like, I want to do something bad because it's bad. Aristotle thinks that would be like nonsense in the mind. He doesn't understand how the reason could do that.
Okay, so what's his point about the wish thing?
The point
is it about intentions?
Yes. Also to discriminate between choices and wish, because a lot of times, if we're talking about the voluntary and we're talking about whether somebody deserves praise or blame for something, if somebody does something really foolish and harmful and they say, well, my intention was, to bring about the good, you can still blame them because you're like, yeah, everybody's intention is that. Why did you do it so stupidly? So for example, if you think that, and I'm not a scientist, but I'm pretty sure, I'm confident in this belief I'm about to share with you. If you think that the way to get through this pandemic is to literally kiss all the strangers in your vicinity while you're contagious and just make everyone else sick and get it over with, like, on the one hand, I can understand you're wishing for the health of everybody else. But on the other hand, you have to really overlook a lot of things that signal to you that that is not the way to do it. For example, 3 to 4% of those people will die, and we could avoid that. So there you go. So you might be wishing for the health of everybody, but you are certainly choosing bad things. You just don't realize it. But the fact that you don't realize it is something Aristotle is not sympathetic to.
So could you say the wish is the ends, but choice is the means?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And in a way, we choose an end, but we choose an end that's a middle step. And so this is hard. It's basically Aristotle's like, look, the end might be health. And then you think about all the planning to how to get there. And so you have like little sub arguments and other steps along the way that you make as like temporary ends. And those are the things that you end up acting on, and you choose them as a means to the greater end. And so the fact that your wish might be a good one is not enough to exonerate you from making poor choices in the middle, because everybody wishes for good and health, and most people don't do it so foolishly. Yeah, good question.
So in order to, like, something has to, okay, I don't know how to word this. So we're talking about you can't be ignorant of the particulars. If you told someone your bookshelf was really light because you thought it was, and then they hurt themselves, that's not entirely your fault because you were ignorant.
Yes.
How is the ignorance that's applied to the intention problem different?
Good. Okay. So Aristotle says two things about this. One, that there are opportunities to know that we miss, and that's our fault. So he says ignorance can be your fault if you're the cause of your ignorance. So for example, if, and actually the bookshelf one might be a bad example because maybe I should know how much a bookshelf is. But for example, here's an example. I've heard, never been to one of these, I've heard that teenagers back in the day, so probably your parents, not me, not my parents, but teenagers back in the day used to go to parties where they would all bring the prescription drugs they stole from their parents' medicine cabinets, throw them in a bowl, and then take turns just taking pills, right? That was evidently a fun time, because stupid. Okay. Now, you might end up having somebody having a reaction or something and getting very, very sick and possibly dying. And you could say, well, I didn't know that this pill was going to do that. Okay, fine. But you stole it from a bottle that lists all the side effects and warnings, and you didn't choose to read that. So you very well could have, and it's your fault for not doing that. So
like willfully being ignorant.
yes, willfully being ignorant, or not taking the responsibility, as in like the obligation to find things out when it's very clear you should. Okay, so that's number one. And then the other one is if you put yourself in what is a state of ignorance is going to be blameworthy, but that's not about the particulars. So you can be ignorant. Sorry, the dog has decided she's going to help me teach. Say hi, Thea. Hello. You can be ignorant of particulars in ways that are usually innocent, but every now and then it's like you had to try not to know that. Or anyone with any sense would have known you don't do that thing with a bowl of pills. By the way, if you've never seen that and you come across that, don't take anything. You have no idea what's in there. Don't take it. Okay. Public service announcement. I think Morgan's going to ask a question. Or is she typing? Where joy hides and how to find it. Okay. And I'm sure those parties still happen. Because, you know, sad, privileged teenagers need to find ways to ruin their lives. Anyway. Yes, it's not just them. Yes, Taylor. Stop me from myself.
So the first one is willful ignorance. What would the second one be called?
Oh, that's the kind that's just vice itself. Okay, so if you are ignorant of the particulars, it can be an excuse, unless it's willful ignorance. And then there's a kind of ignorance that's not about particulars at all. And that is what Aristotle, and this is something I'm actually working on like hard. It's in several chapters of the book I'm writing. I tend to think, because he doesn't give us a lot of explanation, I tend to think when he says ignorance of the universals, Aristotle means ignorance of basic moral truths that everybody should know. So things like murder is wrong and you shouldn't hit people for no reason. So one of my favorite dark comedy things that I think I put in your Just for Fun folder, and if I didn't, let me know, I will, is called Llamas with Hats. Has anybody ever seen Llamas with Hats? I love Llamas with Hats. So Carl is a psychopath.
Oh.
Yes, Carl is a psychopath llama. And in the very first episode, you find that Carl, you know, ate somebody's hands and stabbed him a bunch of times in the chest. And Paul, his friend, is like, why did you do that? And he's like, well, I was hungry. And then he goes, Carl, that kills people. And he's like, oh, really? I did not know that. And he's like, Carl, yes, you did know that. And he's like, well, I didn't know that was a bad thing. So, so that Carl's the example of Aristotle's vicious person. The fact that you don't know that something is bad is actually blameworthy. It's kind of the offense. And the book I'm working on right now is trying to figure out how Aristotle can argue that. So we can talk about it today if you want, but there is no standard, interpretation of what that is. I'm happy to give you mine, but I want to let you know it's completely biased and one-sided because it's not what everyone will say. So do you guys need more on the general ignorance? Like, here are some good examples of general ignorance. If you come across somebody who doesn't understand why we should bother getting consent when we're having sex, that is what I would consider general ignorance. Like, it is just part of being a human being and understanding how to treat people that you don't do that without permission, right? If you come across somebody who thinks that women are inferior to men, somebody like Aristotle, you might say that's not really being ignorant that's not ignorant of particulars. That's like ignorant of more than half a population. So that's basically judging people wrongly in a way that kind of requires you to be a jerk and a bad person and just not care about them the right way. Yeah, Lila.
Okay. So I would assume that racism, being racist, is an example of this kind of ignorance. But could our tolerance of those, like universal truths change when we get new information? Because like now we judge a racist person really harshly. We're like, how could you be prejudiced when you know what you know?
Yeah.
But back a very long time ago,
Everybody
we
was
don't
racist.
tend to judge individual people that were racist or sexist or any other ist
Mhm.
as harshly as we do now. We're more tolerant of them because they didn't know what we know.
Right. Aristotle ironically doesn't say that. But if you are interested, and I know you don't have a lot of free time because you're taking like a million credits, but let me know and I'll send you my first book, which is not on Aristotle. My first book is on my theory of moral responsibility. And I actually talk about praise and blame being relative to how difficult it is to do the right thing. Because I think that if everybody is wrong together, it makes it harder to be right. And so while people who are racist back in the day are still to blame, they're far less blameworthy than somebody who's racist now. Because now you have to discount all the reasons everyone gives you. You have to say, all these people are telling me that I shouldn't be racist, but they're all wrong. So it's like you have to actually, that's the willful, fighting against a thing.
That's what makes sense to me. But I would assume that Aristotle is like more in like a objective sense. Like, no, if it's wrong at this point, it's always wrong, or if it's right at this point, it's always right.
And
So like
don't
he
and
seems
to be
wrong.
clear, I do agree with him on that, on what makes something right or wrong. What
But I
I'm
mean
saying is
the
what makes somebody
tolerance level.
worthy. Yeah, well, what makes somebody worthy of praise or blame
Yeah, our
is
tolerance
sensitive
level.
is sensitive to how hard it was to get it right. Because I think that there are some. So an example I give in that book is Seneca, who is an ancient Stoic philosopher, wrote this really good letter about slavery, where he argues in the letter, slaves bleed like us, they have pain like us, we trust them with our children, they're people too. And then the conclusion of the letter is, so be nice to your slaves. And you're like, like he got this close to saying, so slavery is wrong, right? But he didn't get there. But see, the thing is, like, he was a Roman. And so you want to say to yourself, getting to we should be nice to our slaves is, I guess, progress for the time. And in a lot of ways, we might even praise him because, that took a lot of compassion to recognize. And while he absolutely could have gotten to the slavery's wrong bit, that would have required, going above and beyond what is expected of people of that day to understand. That's Seneca. Now compare him to Ariel Castro. Do people know who Ariel Castro is?
I've heard of him, but I don't know anything.
He is the man who kidnapped several women in Ohio, up near Cleveland, and kept them in his basement for over a decade as his sex slaves. And they gave birth to children and everything, and nobody knew where they were. And then they finally got rescued, I want to say in like 2013. It's an amazing story. They were presumed dead. But Ariel Castro, is living now. Well, he's dead now. He killed himself. But he in prison. But he's somebody where it's like, it's wrong to keep people in your basement for your sexual gratification. You live in the 21st century. So it's like with him, it's very blameworthy because everybody would say you can't do that. And with Seneca, his failure to go all the way to abolishing slavery is not as bad because given the context, that was revolutionary. It's not saying that it wasn't, and I want to be clear about this. I am not saying that slavery was okay back then. Slavery is wrong and has always been wrong. What I'm saying is about how hard or easy it is to be good can determine how heroic or not your success is. I don't consider myself heroic for not owning slaves. I think that's like basic moral ground level nowadays, right? But if Seneca had, freed all his slaves, that would be different because back then it would take a lot of moral insight. So you'd be like, wow, he sees that, But that is something that I guess would be more Aristotle inspired. It's not Aristotle himself. But he does think that he thinks that what you choose is the most telling of who you are. So he does talk about that, I want to say in chapter 2, where he distinguishes choice from opinion. And he says people can have the wrong opinion all the time, but what they choose is what matters. So are you guys familiar? There's a very famous instance in literature philosophers use with Huckleberry Finn. Are you familiar with Huck Finn? Okay. Do you remember the part in Huck Finn where Huck is friends with a slave named Jim? This is going to be the slavery day. I'm sorry. Huck is friends with a slave named Jim, and Jim escapes. And Huck wants to help his friend because he wants his friend to be safe and healthy and happy. So he wants to help his friend escape. But Huck is actually spellbound by the laws of the time. Like, he believes what he's been taught, and he believes that because Jim is property, that he should return him. And he struggles. And he's like, I know I should return him. I know I should turn him in. It's property. It's not right for me to do that. And ultimately, Huck helps Jim escape, and he doesn't turn him in. So in that instance, people call it reverse acrasia. I don't think that's really what's going on. So, well, reverse acrasia. Well, let's start with acrasia. Let's start there. This is something that Aristotle. It's considered. It's called incontinent, I think, in your translation. The incontinent character. That's when somebody believes one thing is right, but then does something else. They believe that they know the better and they do the worse. In Aristotle's mind, incontinence is only, and I know this from what he says in book 7, which we haven't gotten to yet. Incontinence is only going to make sense about people who actually know what's right and actually do what's wrong anyway. But the Huck Finn is supposed to be a counterexample where it's like, well, he was wrong about what he thought was right, and it's good that he didn't follow his reason because he did what his heart said, and his heart was right. And Aristotle is like, that's called getting lucky. That's not called being a good person. Well, actually, what Aristotle would say is if you do the right thing by accident, if you were trying to do the wrong thing and you do the right thing by accident, that's not praiseworthy. However, it does show what you value and there's hope for you. So somebody like Huck Finn could be made into a better person because at least he has the right emotions. But of course you have to get to him soon, because once his reason takes over, maybe in 5 or 6 years, he'll be going and catching slaves and bringing them back. Aristotle doesn't believe that reverse acrasia happens a lot. And if it does, it's only a matter of time before it becomes what somebody really believes because of habit. Okay. So why did I bring that up? So acrasia is the one where you do know and you fail. With Huck Finn, he is wrong and he fails to follow the wrong thing, but he did choose. He did choose to help Jim. So Aristotle would look, well, of course, Aristotle would have to understand how the slave is wrong. So pretend he's enlightened Aristotle. We have to imagine a version of Aristotle that's living today, given his theory. So given Aristotle's theory, what he would say is that Huck Finn made the right choice. And so he's more a good person than not. And choice is different from opinion because sometimes you have the wrong opinions. So sometimes you can have an opinion, but when it comes down to it, you don't act on it. And that might be because deep down inside you have some other conflicting either belief or commitment. I'll pause. That was a lot. Does anyone have any questions about that? So do you understand why I brought in the Huck Finn thing? It's supposed to be an example of somebody who has a kind of acrasia where they don't follow reason and reason is wrong. And so they do the right thing. And Aristotle says, even if that happens, it's lucky. It does signify that the person has the right heart, but that might only be for this week if they keep it up. So we would need some moral intervention soon for that to be something worth celebrating.
So would that action then be considered amoral? Because I feel like it's not really moral or immoral. I feel like it's in some other category of getting lucky, but you still got it right.
That's great. So Aristotle does distinguish between doing virtuous acts and doing virtuous acts virtuously, right? With the adverb virtuously. So it would still be the right thing to do. It would still be the kind of thing you would expect a virtuous person to do. But because of the inner life of the agent, because they were so messed up, Aristotle would say it was not done virtuously. Now that doesn't mean a whole lot, because every right action that is done by anyone who's not virtuous is not done virtuously. So there's a wide spectrum between doing the right thing, almost for the right reason. So maybe, you give to charity because it makes you feel good and you like it, so you give to charity, which is not the best reason, but it's close. So the best reason is you give to charity because it's fine, Fine. You give to charity because it's what ought to be done, because it's beautiful, because it's right, and that you love the fine. That's what Aristotle says. Now, if I give to charity because it makes me feel good, maybe if I keep doing that, I'll also identify it as fine. And if I give to charity because I don't want to look like an asshole in front of people watching me, that's less of a good reason. They're both doing the right thing, but not virtuously. I saw a hand. Where was it? Go for it.
It was me. I'm not sure that this is important in any way, but could you take something that doesn't seem as if it was done for the right reasons, but it actually is? We're just poor at determining our actual reasons. Like, say you donate to charity because you like the way it feels. There are several reasons that could be the cause of you feeling good. One, you might feel good because you know you're doing a good thing in donating, and that is doing it virtuously. It also could be the case that it makes you feel good because of a reputation you get. So something that seems as if we're doing it for the wrong reasons could actually be the right reason. We're just bad at knowing our own causes.
I love that. That's great. I think Aristotle will agree with you, except the following. The virtuous person has the virtue of megalosoukia. Remember I mentioned that?
Yeah.
What's what is megalosoukia?
Knowing the good and knowing you are good.
Yeah. So it's the virtue of being good and having good self-awareness. So the virtuous person does virtuous acts virtuously, and they are aware of their motives. like Aristotle's a real high standard for what it takes to do something virtuously, right? So what you're saying is true of everybody else, but that might actually be more to his point, that because you don't know all of your motives, then I'm going to say you did the right thing, but I'm not going to say you did it the right way, because the only way to do the right thing the right way is to know it, is to knowingly choose it.
Those are super high standards that I don't think anyone reaches, but okay.
Yeah. He thinks it's very rare. I think he thinks people reach it, but he thinks it's very rare, and he's okay with that. And I think a lot of virtue ethicists are, because even if you don't expect most people to become virtuous, if you set a high standard, people, because of what you said, because people aren't really very familiar with their own minds, if you set a high standard and people aim for it, they're more likely to maximize as good as they can be. Like if you really reach for, what do they say? If you reach for a star, you fall on the moon, or something cheesy like that, right? So like by actually trying to be virtuous, even if it's not possible, you'll probably be as good as a continent person can be. Because if you, and this kind of goes with the doctrine of the mean, if you just aim for being a basically good person, you'll probably fall short of being a basically good person. And just so you guys know, this is why I always tell my students, don't decide for yourself what grade you're okay with. This is something I did not understand. Like when I was in undergrad, like this never crossed my mind. I just tried to learn the thing and do well. This never crossed my mind. And now I have students who are like, I'm okay with a B. What do I need to do to get a B? And I'm like, well, you need to try to get an A and make a few mistakes. Like, because if you knew what it took to get a B, or if you knew what it took to get a C, you would know as much or more than I do about it. And you wouldn't be able to communicate it to anybody else, because it would be an intuition from experience. So don't ever take a class and say, I am aiming for a B. It's fine if you're satisfied if you get a B. That's one thing. But do you understand what I'm saying? Where they're like, have you guys heard, or even yourself been guilty of aiming for a grade lower than an A? Okay, yeah, some of you are like, no. Yeah, you're probably not in my class if that's the kind of student you are. But you've heard people say this. You've heard people like say that they are going to try to budget their time so they only study as much as they need to get a C. And I'm like, if you know how much you have to study to get a C, then why wouldn't you just get an A? Because clearly you know all the things. So yeah, so for Aristotle and for virtue ethicists, you aim for perfection, even if you can't, because it's the best way to maximize your potential. Because if you aim for mediocrity, you're not even going to get that, because getting mediocrity requires seeing it correctly, and only the virtuous person sees mediocrity correctly, and they don't want to be that, so they wouldn't do it. We can also switch subjects if you guys have other questions. I don't know which caffeine I want to have right now. So we can talk about mixed actions. We can talk about, what choice is. Because don't forget, choice and the voluntary are different. Related, but different.
Can you explain why mixed actions are not constraints?
Great, Allison. Great question. Okay. So the example Aristotle gives us, it's not timeless. So let me explain it. He tells you that you're in a ship and you're throwing cargo overboard. Remember that? And you're probably like, okay, sailor, what? Okay. So back in the day, Greece is on the Mediterranean. And so there were lots of ships carrying cargo to and from ports. And also they didn't have the kind of craftsmanship that we have now. And so ships sunk all the time. And they sunk if they hit a bad storm. So seafaring was very dangerous. And so what would happen is if you were in one of these boats with cargo and then you hit a really bad storm, one of the ways to not have the ship sink is to throw overboard all the heavy stuff, because that way the boat wouldn't actually sink into the water lower, and it wouldn't allow as much water to come over the sides. So oftentimes people be put in a situation in a storm where they had to decide whether to abort the mission of bringing the cargo and throw it away, or try to keep it and risk losing the entire ship and everybody's lives. Okay. So Aristotle says, if you're a captain of a ship and you're in a storm and you have to decide to throw things overboard, there's a sense in which that's not voluntary. And by the way, when he says a sense in which, beware, he's probably going to, do a 180 in 5 seconds. There's a sense in which it's involuntary, because if you take the abstract action, if you take the situation away and you say discarding of property, discarding of property that you intend to sell, right? Nobody would want to do that in the abstract. Nobody would want to do that. But Aristotle says we never act in the abstract. We're always acting in specific situations. So in this situation, it turns out that while nobody wants to get rid of their cargo, it's maybe desirable at that moment to get rid of your cargo if the alternative is everybody dies. So what makes it a mixed action is, in the abstract, it's an undesirable thing nobody would want to do and you wouldn't do voluntarily, but in the actual situation, you are doing it voluntarily because it's desirable given the situation. I would also add that the reason why mixed actions are, as a matter of fact, voluntary. They're voluntary. And that is because what I said just a minute ago, that mixed actions, like all actions, happen in real life, in real circumstances. So if the circumstance is what makes it a desirable action, then it is a desirable action, because it's not like you act with no circumstances ever. That's number one. And then number two, we feel compelled to have sympathy for the captain, and that part is right. We, as Lila said, misidentify the reasons behind that feeling. So if you say, I feel bad for the captain, I don't want to blame him for losing the cargo, you're right. The reason why you don't want to blame him, though, isn't because he lost the cargo involuntarily. You don't want to blame him because he didn't do anything blameworthy, because it was the best thing he could do at the time. So what Aristotle is saying is, Aristotle is famous for using what we call the endoxa, the common opinion, or what, like common sense belief. And he's like, and he often says the endoxa gets a lot right, but then they get themselves confused because it's, the masses. We get ourselves confused. So what the masters have right is that you shouldn't blame the captain. What they have wrong is the reason why you shouldn't blame the captain. And the captain isn't blameless because what he did was involuntary. He's blameless because what he did was good in that situation. Because the alternative is to let everybody else drown. Okay? So what is normally not a good action today during the storm is a good action. So we don't blame him because we don't blame, like, do you blame somebody for telling the truth? Do you blame somebody for giving to charity? It sounds like a category mistake because it is, right? You blame people when they do bad things. You blame people when they do bad things voluntarily. And so what Aristotle is saying is people are like, I don't want to blame them. It must be that it wasn't voluntary. And it's like, no, it's the other one. You don't want to blame him because what he did wasn't actually bad. It's just usually bad. But today it was good.
So it's like when you have to choose between two evils, you're good for picking the lesser evil, but that doesn't change the fact that it's still technically bad. So they've done the best they can in their circumstances, but the best they can is bad.
Yeah. And it might be bad objectively without them, but it was good in that situation because it was the best. Because Aristotle does believe in hierarchies of goods, like some things are better than others. So think of it this way. If we wanted to only blame people when they chose something and there couldn't possibly have been a better situation, we would never blame anybody. So for example, I might want to go into a grocery store and get milk, and I might prefer not to pay for it, right? I might prefer that it's free. So am I acting in a mixed action when I go to the checkout counter and I actually pay for it? Am I being compelled because I can't get it for free? I have to pay for the price they ask. So we don't act in ideal circumstances ever. So think of it as a slippery slope. If we say that any time you act voluntarily in tough situations makes it not voluntary, then where do we draw the line to when it actually counts again? Because most of the time, we have less than ideal circumstances. For example, voting is coming up. Perhaps you don't like any of the candidates. Welcome to democracy. People rarely do, okay? So are you going to say you were forced to vote for one of them because the one you wanted wasn't there? And were you really forced, or was it just that the best choice at the time was this one, and so you voluntarily did the best choice? I think we use the word forced hyperbolically to distance ourselves from our own responsibilities. For example, if somebody says, hey, do you want to go out drinking? You say, no, I can't. I have to study. You don't really mean you can't. Like the laws of physics are going to stop you. And you don't really mean that you have to study the way you have to breathe or you die. What you mean is, no, I'm not going drinking because I have chosen to study because I value studying over being drunk. And I value having better grades over being drunk. So we might say we can't, but if we really meant we can't in a sense that it's involuntary, it's not up to us, that would be nuts. That would mean everything's involuntary. I'm going to pause and see if there are questions. I feel like there's a lot of confusion. Like,
What would be an example of like an actual constraint?
Oh, yes, good. Allison. So you're not going to like this. Aristotle thinks constraints are always physical. So like what a lot of students rightfully complain about with this chapter is they say, well, the things that Aristotle calls involuntary actions aren't even their actions. So he gives you the example of like, if a mob of people pick you up and move your body, you didn't voluntarily move. And you might say, I'm not sure I would say I moved. I would say somebody moved me, right? Back then, they thought of anything that happened to you as being also something you do. So having someone take your hand and smack somebody else with it, that's an involuntary action. Like you hit someone, sort of, but it wasn't you. That's why Aristotle says that constraint only works as an excuse if the agent contributed nothing. And while your hand might have been used as a tool to hit the person, what your agency is your reason and your appetite. So your reason and appetite contributed nothing. Now, when you're on the ship, when you're the captain with the cargo on the ship, like, you make a decision to throw the cargo over. And when you make that decision, you move towards it and pick it up of your own free will and throw it over. Now, the fact that you don't want to throw it over is besides the point. It's still something that you have control over doing. So basically what Aristotle is saying is, we do things we don't want to, or do things ways that we would prefer not to, all the time. It doesn't make it involuntary. What makes it involuntary is if we are being used as a tool, like when somebody grabs your hand and hits somebody else with it, or when we are ignorant of particulars where we don't really know what we're doing. So the ignorance of particulars is an excuse, because in a way, it means you're not voluntarily choosing to do that thing. You think you're choosing something else. So here's another example of ignorance of particulars. If, let's say, this is a weird situation I'm making up as I go, so bear with me. Let's say Allison says to Abby, hey, Abby, would you mind getting my glass of milk for me? It's around the corner in the little kitchenette. And we don't know why, but Morgan was told to, like, mix some rat poison in a mug, because I guess we have rats in the office now. Sure, that works. And for whatever reason, the rat poison in the mug looks just like milk. And Abby grabs the wrong one and gives it to Allison, and she drinks it and she's poisoned, right? Now, Aristotle would say that you were ignorant of the relative particulars and you did not poison her voluntarily. Aristotle would say that Morgan didn't poison her voluntarily, because Morgan, when she was mixing the thing, didn't know that anyone was going to actually drink it. She figured, I'm going to look away for 2 seconds, nothing's going to happen, which normally is true, because why would anybody drink out of a cup that's not theirs? And the only reason why Allison drank out of a cup that was not hers is because she thought it was hers, because Abby got it, because Abby thought it was hers. So it took all these things of people being misinformed about facts. And in that sense, Aristotle would say those actions are involuntary. So involuntary from constraint is very rare. If you want an example of involuntary from constraint that isn't as obviously physical, like it's not like somebody grabbing your hand and hitting somebody, you could imagine somebody spiking the milk on purpose to make someone, like, deliriously incoherent. So if you think you're drinking milk and you drink it, and, like, some prankster, I don't know, put LSD in it, you're not voluntarily doing whatever the heck you do after that because you didn't choose to ingest LSD. Now, if you get yourself drunk, that's different. Lila.
I feel like the question I'm about to ask, I feel like I've read about it before, and in Aristotle, I think, and I can't remember if it's in this book or another book, because they just all blend together.
Sure.
But what about when someone is, like, in the process, but they're not the one doing the bad thing, but it is by them that the bad thing is possible, but they don't actually do anything, like a scientist that just does ordinary research, and then someone uses their research to do a bad thing. Where does the scientist stand to blame? He didn't do anything, but without him, the bad thing isn't possible.
Lila, I think you're thinking, and it is in this chapter, of what we call merely non-voluntary actions. Does that sound familiar to you a little? And I did teach you this in 211. So the merely non-voluntary goes like this. The example I give in a published paper is called the example of Terrible Terry, where Terry is a child-hating bastard. Not that child-hating is bad, but he's child-hating and a bastard. And he's driving down the street, and unbeknownst to him, a child chases a ball into the street out from between two parked cars. There is no way Terry could have seen him. There's no way Terry could have stopped in time, and Terry hits the kid and the kid dies. So Aristotle says we would never say, I mean, this isn't Aristotle's example, it's mine, but Aristotle would say we would never blame Terry for killing the child because he didn't voluntarily kill the child. However, we won't give him pity if he does this. If he starts to laugh and says, ha ha ha, one fewer brats in the world, yay. So this is why Aristotle specifies that involuntary actions are always painful. And he doesn't necessarily mean painful at the time, but painful when you realize what you did. So, so in Terry's case, the fact that he doesn't have any regret and he doesn't feel any pain when he realizes what he did, it's almost like after the fact he's endorsing his action. But it doesn't count as voluntary because he didn't know the relevant particulars. So technically speaking, his act is non-voluntary. And then Aristotle starts to split hairs and says, but it's not involuntary, because involuntary acts are non-voluntary acts that are painful because they go against who you are. They go against your will. So then you end up with this. You have voluntary acts and non-voluntary acts. Of the non-voluntary acts, some are merely non-voluntary, where the person didn't mean to do it, but they also don't care that they did it. And then there are ones that are involuntary, where the person didn't mean to do it, and they feel bad about doing it. And we only really excuse and like pity someone who does something involuntarily. We will excuse the action, but judge the character of Terry.
So if Terry does feel bad, that is involuntary.
That is the only difference between a merely non-voluntary and an involuntary action,
Okay.
is whether you have pain. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Now, this is not to say that if you have pain, everything you do is involuntary, because you can voluntarily go to the gym because you know it's good for you and have lots of pain, but you knew that was happening, right? So it's not like all pain means involuntary stuff. It just means that if an action is involuntary, it has to be painful. That like the realization that you did something you didn't mean to do is supposed to bother you. Because that is kind of like the litmus test of it not being yours, because it's not what you would have wanted to do. And there can be merely non-voluntary actions that are trivial, right? So for example, you know, let's say I say something true to Lila, and it's just because I was telling the truth, but it's something that makes her very happy to know about. I didn't voluntarily, you know, lift her spirits, but I'm not upset that I lift her spirits. It's not like it pains me that I lifted your spirits because this, yeah. So, I mean, there are lots of things that are merely non-voluntary and it doesn't matter. It means like, you're okay with it. It's fine. Like, good. Okay. Nice to know. And that's fine. That is not a problem. It's only a problem when you probably should regret it, like Terry. So the mixed actions are Aristotle's way of explaining to us that having subpar options is not enough to be excused, because we often have subpar options, and that's number one. And number two, let's say you do the right thing in one of those situations and we want to praise you. So let's say we've got the captain and it was a really tough decision. Let's say some of the cargo was his and it was precious to him, and he threw it over because he wanted to save his crew and himself. Well, we might praise the captain for doing something that he probably didn't want to do because it was the right thing. Like, you praise him for doing the right thing despite him really not wanting to. And if you praise somebody, what has to be true? And if you're going to say it again?
It was the right thing.
Yes, and one other thing has to be true.
That's voluntary.
Yes. So that's another thing you can do too. You can ask yourself, is the action something that if it were good, I'd want to praise? Because if that's the case, chances are it's voluntary. Because Aristotle has a symmetry principle that he seems to subscribe to. That so for example, if you do the right thing because it feels good to you to do the right thing, you can't say, oh, I don't deserve praise because my appetite wanted to. because Aristotle's going to say, when would you do it without your appetite? Appetite's the only way you move. so, it's okay to praise yourself. And that's why we don't let people off the hook when they do bad things out of anger. And we don't let people off the hook when they do bad things out of sadness. Because if we let them off the hook, then we couldn't praise anybody when they do good things out of joy. But we want to. That's actually the only time we do praise people, when they do the right thing, So I'll pause for questions. I know there's a lot. The bells are singing to you. Is that all you guys got? I thought, maybe I was wrong. I thought chapters 1 through 5 were awesome.
I have another question, but it's unrelated to the mixed actions.
That's great. Go for it.
Can you explain, so if someone becomes vicious, can you explain, can they ever not become vicious?
Yay! I love your questions, Allison. Okay, so that's a debate. My position is yes, but not voluntarily at first. So some people will say no, because Aristotle says a few things that suggest he means no. So at one point, and I think it might be in chapter 5. Did you get the example of throwing the stone in chapter 5 and letting it go?
I remember reading that, but I don't know if it's in chapter 5.
Okay, well, it was in your assignment today, so there you go. I think that's in chapter 5. So Aristotle says, that once you're vicious, it's not up to you not to be vicious. And he says it's like if you have a stone and you let it go, like you throw a stone, before you let it go, it was up to you to throw it or not. But once it's out of your hands, you can't get it back. And so Aristotle says that vice is like that. And I do think he means that. But I think he means you can't get it back. I think given his moral psychology, if somebody else were to get the stone and bring it to you, that's a different story. And so what would that look like? Well, if you have a really rotten, vicious, thoroughly rotten person, and they're hopeless, but somehow you incentivize them, like you're in a prison, for example, and you incentivize them to do the kinds of things that normal good people do. And maybe they do them for all the wrong reasons. Maybe they do them for, a good reputation. Maybe they do them to get, extra money at the canteen. Maybe they do them for whatever. Who cares? If you get somebody to do the kinds of things that are right over and over again, I think that their bad habit of being vicious can be broken, and they can be enlightened into becoming incontinent. That does not mean that they're good yet. It just means that now they understand why they suck. And then you want to hope that the regret they feel after they act badly is enough to help them become continent. So I do think on Aristotle's program, the vicious people can improve. And he does say in a passage in the categories that I did not assign to you, he does say that if a bad man is led into better ways by someone else, and if time permits, they can make moral progress. He does say that. But again, it's like it takes a lifetime to become vicious. Like, you have to work at being vicious until for at least 40 years. So you might need another 40 to get out of it. And back then people didn't live that long. So I think in theory he thought it could happen, but I think it was something that was so much work and required the person to actually improve that it was I think Aristotle would just sooner lock them all up and throw away the key.
Dr. Anton, if you don't mind, I actually have the paper you wrote about that on hand. I can put it in the chat so that people can look at it.
That's fine. Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. And so what Lila's sharing with you is something that I still sort of believe, but I've revised my beliefs a little bit. And I'm actually writing a new version of it someday. I've been writing it the way I'm writing my book. You do 50 things at once, and every single project gets a page longer. Anyway, so in that article, it was before I actually taught in prisons. So I give some prescriptions at the end that now that I know how prisons runs, I'm like, no, don't do that. Never mind. So like the spirit is absolutely true, the theory is absolutely true, but I know too much about people that run prisons, and frankly, I think people who run prisons, too many of them themselves are vicious or incontinent. So I don't trust them with the moral correction of prisoners in a lot of ways. But if you had like really good people in charge of prisons, that would be one thing. I just don't see that ever happening in our country, for way too many reasons. The fact that it's all monetized, the fact that it's for profit, that yeah. So
Dr. Anton,
yeah.
this may not be completely on topic, but just like thinking about prisons, that's an issue I've thought about a lot since I took your class last year, like how prisons could be improved. Well, you'd think it doesn't need to be a capitalistic thing because people are going to try to make money off it. But then even if it's run by the state, it still needs money to operate. So then at that point, the state would try to find a way to profit from the prison to run it. So the issue is it takes money to run the prison itself.
Yep.
Like I don't really know where I'm going with that. I just don't, like, in my head I can't think of a way.
Have it funded by rich moral philosophers, which sounds like an oxymoron.
Okay,
Right,
but
good luck finding them.
I have a question for Lila. How's a moral philosopher ever going to get rich?
That's what I said. That was the oxymoron. If you could find one, our problem would be solved.
You guys, I love that this came up, because you'll notice in the not in the next reading we read courage, but when we start reading on temperance and the other virtues, Aristotle says it's really, really hard for a generous person to become rich, because it would be part of your nature to always give it away. Like if somebody's a billionaire, they probably lack the virtue of generosity, or it's something they came across much later in life, because you don't get to that position without being kind of stingy. Yeah. So to Dalton's question, it's a good one. So I'll give some thoughts, and I want to hear what other people have to say about it. First of all, and this is the same answer I would give for single payer healthcare, in case you're interested in that. There is a difference. It's not much. It's more about a difference in degree and not difference in kind. There's a difference between the state running something and a for-profit place running it, because the state has to break even. The for-profit place has to make more money than they put in. So right there's a difference in incentive, that they have to actually keep more money and spend less of it doing their job. Whereas with the state, they might want more money, but they don't, by being not for profit, they're not supposed to make money. They're just supposed to break even. So that's number one. So that's, and if you're wondering about healthcare, medical insurance is a middleman, and medical insurance has to make money off of you. And so it has to have you pay more than they will ever pay for you if you get sick. So if you had single payer healthcare and they weren't making money off of, they just need to break even. So they can actually give out more. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, we have a labor system right now that most people don't know about. So Dalton met one of my former students that was incarcerated for 32 years. And I'm sure Twilight told you that everybody in prison, unless they outright refuse, but most of them don't, has a job. And they work minimally 40 hours a week, usually more. And they get paid between 10 and 30 cents an hour. Because believe it or not, if you look in the Constitution, under the 13th Amendment, it says that you cannot force people to do labor unless they're prisoners. So it actually outlaws slavery except for prisoners. And that is why the minimum wage does not apply to them, right? So what we have is we have these businesses going in and basically having sweatshop labor with the prisoners, paying them nothing, and then making beaucoup profits. So what you could do is actually use the profits of those works and put them back into the prison to run the prison, instead of making somebody rich outside. I'm just, spitballing here, but call me crazy.
That's another thing I want to mention. So, well, the issue with minimum wage is it's supposed to be something that someone can live off of.
Right. Yes, that's also a problem.
But to some degree, and it's not that, which is an issue, but to some degree, we couldn't just pay prisoners. I need to get this out. It's going to sound bad. It's going to take me a second to formulate. We couldn't just pay a minimum wage because they are living somewhere, so they'd have to pay their living expenses. But then whoever decided that would probably overcharge them so they could pay them even less, and
Which
not.
is in fact what happens. For real. Like if you look at an itemized list of like how much people say they are charged. So prisoners get charged for all sorts of luxuries. Like they have to buy their own soap and their own toothpaste. And if you look at what it costs in the canteen, you and I would never pay that for soap or toothpaste. Yeah. Yeah.
Campus is the same way.
Oh yeah. And
It is so much cheaper to buy things off campus.
yeah. And then think about airports. They know that you can't buy any, drinks once you get through security. So a bottle of water is suddenly $4. Yeah.
I was coming from Texas to Nashville and my phone was dying and I had to have a phone to tell the person picking me up when I landed. And I left my phone charger when I left. And the cheapest phone charger I could find in the Houston airport was $30.
Yeah. Like insane. Yeah. Also, we don't need to lock up nearly half the people we lock up. I mean, just like first of all, if you legalize all the drugs, that would get rid of a third of our prisoners. Second of all, if you don't lock everybody up who is a non-violent offender, I mean, we have people locked up for, silly things. We have a very all or nothing justice system. So if you're guilty, fuck you. And if you're innocent, fine. There's not a whole lot of like, you're guilty, but we think you can have a second chance, or you're guilty and you owe us some community service, but hopefully that'll be enough. Like there's not a whole lot of in between. So I appreciate the question though, Dalton, because it's an important one. So what Dalton's referring to is I actually use my views of Aristotle's theory in prison. I even taught Aristotle in prison. They absolutely loved it. Because it's all about habit and order. And if you know anything about a prison, nobody's life is more regulated and ordered and habituated than the person in prison. And you would think that all that habit would make them better, but we have a terrible recidivism rate. Our recidivism is 67% of people who are released from prison will be back in prison within 5 years. And so I think, as Aristotle would say, it's not just about mechanical habit. It's about habits of thinking and feeling.
That was another thing I wanted to mention. When you mentioned the if you throw the rock, someone has to give it back to you. In a way, I guess you would have given Twilight's rock back to him. Even though also I don't know if Twilight was ever given a rock to begin with, considering like how he grew up.
Yeah.
But then like there's the issue is like domino effects. It's like one bad thing can cause so many other bad things to happen. And one good thing, like what you did, and then Twilight was trying to like show, like give the rock to the others in the prisons. That's why they put him in charge of like what was it called?
It was like a gang exit program. Yeah, like so.
Like they like put him in charge of a barrack. I can't think of it, but like
a pod. Yeah.
A pod.
Yeah.
And,
or a block.
Like, but so many people like I feel like even if you're trying to like you don't know a good thing if it'll hit you in the face, they don't realize they're like being given a chance because they're so used to with the way prison is like I don't really know but like it's hard to like get more good things to happen. It's easy to let more bad things happen.
I think that's true, and I think Aristotle would agree because he says that there's infinitely many ways to go wrong and only a few ways to go right. So just mathematically speaking, especially in a place like prison, you're more likely to get bad influences than good ones, which is why a lot of people who go in for stupid crimes end up coming out worse because they actually get influenced by worse people they meet in there, So yeah, so what Dalton's talking about, and I can't take credit for Twilight. Twilight did his own thing on his own, and I was one of a few people on his path. So Twilight's first sentence was 242 years. He was sent to prison to die. He was a very, very, very bad person in the 70s and 80s. But he started taking my classes in prison. He took Kate King's classes in prison before me. So he was already, on his way when I met him. But, like you said, it's good to have sustained good things to kind of keep you on the path, And Aristotle is sensitive to this in the following way. Aristotle does say it is politics' job. I know this is going to sound weird, but he says it is the politician's job to arrange the state such that it encourages moral behavior. And this is not the same thing as like a theocracy, right? Because Aristotle didn't actually follow any practicing religion like that. What Aristotle means is that you should make laws that prevent people from doing bad things and incentivize people to do good things. And you should enforce them that way. And if he saw our country, I think he'd be pretty disappointed, because the people who have the most victims are offenders of white collar crime. People who break the law with what they call white collar crime can bankrupt and make people homeless by just stealing their money. But somebody who is guilty of that almost never goes to jail. And to quote a famous senator, but if you or I go into a, convenience store and rob $20 out of the cash register, we are going to jail. Our system is weird, where if you rob a little thing, physically, we consider it jail time. But if you rob like decimal points and zeros on a computer, evidently it's not. So I think what Aristotle would say is, we're doing it wrong. Because we actually incentivize things like corporate crime. We make it really easy to get away with.
We also don't incentivize good behavior.
Tell me more. I want to hear more about it.
Not incentivizing good behavior?
Yeah.
There's the only reason, other than just someone that wants to do the good for its good, we're ignoring those people.
Like it's not sexy, it doesn't make the news, that kind of thing.
The obvious reason that we have not to do bad things is simply to avoid the punishment. So it's basically doing good things is the standard. And so we are punished for doing bad things, but there's no incentive for doing good things.
I got you. That makes a lot of sense. And that would be something that would be weird, again, to Aristotle and people of his day, with the caveat that, of course,
should want to do good, right?
Say it again.
People just should want to do good. We shouldn't have to incentivize it, but it's almost.
Well, that's what I'm saying. We're ignoring, because that doesn't happen often.
I think that you're both right. I think that ideally people should want to be good. But as, I mentioned before, Seneca says even the virtuous person gets there through sinning. So like, while we should, or was it Augustine? I forget. I think that was Seneca. But if we should do something just because it's right, that's what the virtuous person does. The rest of us who are not there yet and might never be there are going to need incentives. So, we should be doing both. We should be doing both. And if we give people the incentive to avoid the bad thing, it seems, asymmetrical to not give people the incentive to do the good thing, right? Like it seems kind of insincere, two-faced, Also, just so you know, like child psychologists have found that most people respond to positive reinforcement more than negative reinforcement. So, knowing that, if you're a good lawmaker, knowing that, you would put more positive reinforcements into your laws. Yeah.
I think that's true even not with children, because I worked at a McDonald's for a really long time. And whenever we have inspections, our like superiors are like, if we pass the inspection, we will get everyone pizza.
Oh,
So like,
nice.
so yeah, and so we tend to work harder if we know we're getting something out of it that we wouldn't ordinarily get.
Yeah.
But if they were just like, yeah.
Like, we'll just punish you if you don't. And you're like, well, you're going to punish me in one way or another because I know you'll find a way. And that is actually something they do inside, by the way, which at first I thought was weird, but I get it now because like I've had prison food. It's horrible. Absolutely horrible. So in prison, at least in my prison, if the pod can go so many days without somebody having been writ up, or if they have like a certain like nobody gets more than this many violations, and you can get a violation for anything, for like not tucking your towel in correctly, right? Like if they do that for like a month time, then they get to pick a fast food restaurant that somebody will go get the food and bring in. So like, one time they'll all get like McDonald's, another time they'll get Taco Bell. So, and they tell me like they want their Taco Bell, like they do it. Like that's serious, man. Like, do you know what they have to eat if they don't? Ooh. All right. So yes, go ahead.
It's like the pizza party model.
Yeah, it's exactly right. It's exactly right. Okay. So
we did that in a class one time. Like she was just trying to test us, like what we would do as a class. And so she broke us up, and she's like, if you all work together, like legitimately, I'll buy you pizza. And like, we were the only class that didn't fail. Like one person ruined it. They wanted to see if this was really like, if she was really going to keep her word. And we were all like, we were the only people I know, it was weird. We were the only class to be unanimous about it, and we actually achieved it, and we got the pizza party.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Also, it's weird because I feel like, what do you have to lose if she is lying? You ended up doing your job for a day. Just do it. I used to do that when I had class in person, right, Dalton? Dalton remembers this. Abby remembers this, where if I would tell my students that if enough of them had passed the quiz, I'd bring Thea the next week, And it was weird. People studied and did better on their quizzes because they wanted to see my dog. And part of me is like, do the studying all the time. But another part of me is like, I get it. She's awesome. She's worth the extra. Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you have to go, it's fine because I kept you over. But keep reading. We're going to talk about courage next. In a time when we need it most. Okay. Be good. Bye.